Hey there, capstone class. Welcome back to our class. I tried to introduce you guys to my dog last time and it didn't work, but I have him here because I have a treat in my hand and he really wants it. So you guys are gonna get to meet Eddie. There he is. He's a cutie. Eddie, say hi to the kids. There you go. Okay. Now that that's out of the way. This is our second lecture on party identification. I wanted to make sure that we got 2 full days in with this one because it's such an important part of American politics. Partisanship and parties are really sort of the lifeblood of what goes on in the United States when it comes to politics. So just to recap a little bit, let's take a look at 2 of the theories we were talking about last time, and I'll introduce a couple of phrases that we actually forgot to mention. There we go. Okay, so 2 theories of partisanship. We talked about one theory that I'm actually going to call that instrumental partisanship. So this is over here on the left-hand side of the screen. Instrumental partisanship is that sort of more unstable style of partisanship. It responds to time and place. It responds to party performance. It responds to ideologies and issue positions. That's what we think of when we think of what parties should actually be. But then there's this other theory, and that's the one here on the right, where partisanship is what we call expressive. It develops through positive and negative feelings about social groups that are associated with the parties, which means it's highly stable, right? Because we don't just wake up in the morning and suddenly like or dislike social groups that we felt different about the day before. That takes many years to change. So that's why we think that expressive partisanship is very stable. Then we said that style of partisanship can lead to social identification to varying degrees, right? We talked about social ID extensively. It means that you feel affiliated with a group, and that group filters into your personal self-concept and personal self-esteem. So people who feel strong social identification with the party, they have a preference for positive group distinctiveness. They want their party to look really good because that makes them feel good. It leads to an us versus them mentality, and it also leads to in-group bias. And it's important to remember that not everyone feels very strongly socially identified with a party, right? This is something that has varying degrees because it's a variable. So some people feel low levels of social identification with parties and some people feel high levels. That's kind of where we left off last time. So let's keep talking about this level of social identification that people have with parties. So the big question is, so what, right? So what? People feel highly identified with the partisan group that they're in. What does that actually translate into? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a very well-known study. This is by Huddy, Mason, and Arrow. These are sort of really big names in the partisanship research field. And this study is called Expressive Partisanship, Campaign Involvement, Political Emotion, and Partisan Identity. So I'm going to go through a little bit of this study, and then we'll actually get to some pretty fun stuff. So here we go. The research question of this study goes like this. Which measure of partisanship is more predictive of political activity and behavior? Instrumental partisanship, that's stuff about issues and ideology and party performance, or expressive partisanship, that style of partisanship that we get through the social group attachments, and it's a psychological identification. So they use 2 different types of studies. One is observational, so no experimental manipulation, and one is a survey experiment. They're going to use 4 samples of people. They use a student sample, a nationally representative sample, a sample of New York residents, and this is the important one, political activists who are recruited from blogs. You know how there's blogs and there's really, really crazy political people on them that comment all the time? That's what they're going for. So they say, you've got to ask these people lots of questions, and the important independent variables here are both measures of partisanship, right? So we have to get their instrumental level of partisanship, which is basically going to be asking them lots of questions about their issue positions and how strongly they feel about those issue positions, and also measuring their ideology. We have not yet talked about ideology. That's going to be the next class. But ideology is, well, there's different types, but in this case, it's a belief system. Do you believe that government should be very active in the economy, or do you believe that it should stay out of the economy? Those types of questions will get at someone's level of instrumental partisanship, that sort of unstable one. But then they also have to ask the social identity questions. These are the questions that they're using. How important is being a Democrat or Republican to you? How well does the term Democrat or Republican describe you? When talking about Democrats or Republicans, how often do you use the word we instead of they? That's a good indicator of how socially identified you are. So they're going to ask them those questions as well, and that's their measure of partisan identity. And what are they going to do with these variables? Well, they're going to see how well they predict political activity. So all of these people across all the samples get a slew of questions about how involved they have been in the 2008 and 2012 elections, how often they donate to candidates, lots of behavior that seems kind of activist-like. They're also going to eventually ask them questions about their level of anger and enthusiasm, but we'll get to that in just a second. Okay. So let's take a look at this screen. I'm not going to go through all of this. I know that this is a lot. But on the left-hand side over here, we have our independent variables. So this first one, which I have not yet talked about, partisan strength is just, if we were to ask someone where they fall on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being a strong Democrat and 7 being a strong Republican, if we were to fold that scale and just make it so everyone at the top end of the scale is really, really strong partisan for either party, and everyone at the bottom end of the scale is pretty much not a partisan at all, it's just a measure of that strength. So are you just a strong Republican or strong Democrat by that label only? That's what they mean by partisan strength. Partisan identity, the second one here, that's the really important one. That's how much someone identifies with the partisan group. It's all those questions that I just showed you. And then the other ones, ideological issue intensity and ideological identity, those are the measures of instrumental partisanship. So everything beneath that is a control. Political knowledge, your education level, your income level, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's a lot of numbers here. We are not going to go through all of them. But I want you guys to check out the second row of numbers, because that's the partisan identity measure that we are interested in. So each one of the columns represents a different sample. I want you guys to look where my arrow is circling. It says 0.38, right? What that number is showing is that the measure of partisan identity, those questions of, I use the phrase we instead of they when I talk about Democrats, that number is really large here, 0.38. It's much larger than the measure of partisan strength. Just, do you call yourself a strong Democrat or strong Republican? It's much, much larger than someone's level of ideological issue intensity, so how strongly they feel about issues. And it's stronger than pretty much everything else in the list. Every time that variable gets added to the equation, so we can just go right across here, 0.47, that's very strong. All the way across here to the other sample, 0.22. Pretty much every time that variable gets added into the equation, it is predicting people's level of campaign involvement much, much stronger than all the other variables. Those questions about, you know, do you use the word we versus they when you talk about what party you belong to, that is a much better predictor of how much campaign activity, that's our dependent variable, people are engaging in. It predicts better than all of the other types of partisanship that they have in here and all of the ideological identities that they have in here. But this is a table and it's much easier to look at graphics. So let's do that. So here we have the graphics. So on the x-axis, that is someone's level of partisan identity. So as that number goes up, they become really strongly identified with their party. Those are people who love their partisan group. They feel very, very attached to it. Those are people all the way at the end of the scale, okay? So that first row, that's all measures of partisan identity across 3 different samples of people. On the bottom row, down here, these are the issue identity and issue importance scales. So as people move from a 0 all the way up to a 1, that means issues are really, really important to them. Issues like healthcare are really, really important to them. Issues like taxes are really, really important to them. So everything on the top has to do with partisanship, expressive, that's psychological attachment. Everything at the bottom has to do with instrumental, that issue-based type of partisanship. On the y-axis, we have the amount of political activity people are engaged in. So as that number goes up, they're engaged in more political activity. Now just take a look at this image and ask yourself, what's going on here? Is there a difference between what's happening at the top row versus what's happening at the bottom row? It should be clear. The angles on the top row are steeper than the angles at the bottom row, consistently. So look at this top left-hand corner. These are the people who are like really, really partisan activists. They come from those political blogs. They're recruited off of there. As their partisan identity goes up, that social identity, they become much more politically involved. Now look at those same people on the bottom row, which is the bottom left. That line pretty much looks flat. There's a little bit of an incline, but not that much. That means that as their issue intensity goes up, that sort of instrumental partisanship, it's not predicting how much they actually are involved in campaign activity. But that top row does, that social identity really does. And the same can be said of the student sample and the YouGov sample, right? As students get a stronger social identity with the party, they participate a lot more. Whereas in the bottom row, bottom middle, pretty much nothing is going on. As their issue importance and issue intensity levels increase, it actually looks like it's going down. They're participating less or not nearly as much as in the top row. So that's very interesting. That shows that expressive partisanship, that psychological attachment, really is that much more predictive of how people behave. The second part of their study, which is actually a pretty fun study, uses a survey experiment. So they take the people who are from the blog sample, those really sort of intense political people, and they put them into a survey experiment. They are randomly assigned into one of 5 groups. Some people are going to read a fake news article that has what we call an electoral threat inside of it. And that's going to be telling them that their party is poised to lose in an upcoming election, okay? So they're either going to hear an electoral threat, your party is going to lose, or they're going to hear this bottom row, electoral reassurance, your party is going to win. And they also vary who this comes from. Sometimes it's coming from someone from your own party, and sometimes it's coming from someone who's in another party. So you can be in any of those four groups, or you can be in a control group that sees nothing. They want to know what happens to people after they read these fictitious stories. They're going to figure out how angry these people are, especially if they've been threatened, or how enthusiastic these people are, especially if they've been reassured that their party is going to win. Why do we care about anger and enthusiasm? This is a little outside the bounds of our course, but anger and enthusiasm are what we call approach emotions. They make people want to go out and participate. Even anger. Anger makes people want to go out and do things because they're angry. So they want to see how much anger and enthusiasm do people feel after they are exposed to this. So let's take a look at the results. So on the left-hand side, you've got the anger column, and on the right-hand side, you have the enthusiasm column. And on the top, so let's look at the top left. Up here, as someone's partisan identity goes up, their level of anger, if they've been threatened, goes up quite a bit. That's quite a predictive relationship there. Let's move down to the bottom left. The issue intensity. Issue intensity goes up and it's not doing anything to their anger if they've been threatened. So right here on the left-hand column, this is all about your partisan identity as a social group. Nothing to do with your issue intensity. Let's move over here to the right-hand panel. Once again, as partisan identity gets higher, people's level of enthusiasm goes up if they've been reassured that their party is going to win. That's a clear increase in that line. It is not quite as much of an increase on the bottom right-hand corner. These are the same people. As their issue intensity increases, there's a little bit of an increase in their level of enthusiasm if they have been told that their party is going to win, but not as much as what's coming from their partisan social identity. So what we see here is that your level of social identity with the party, it's just a better predictor of people's emotional reactions and what they're willing to actually act on, their behavior. All right, so this would be a good time to take a pause in the video. If you're a little bit bored, we're talking about a quantitative study, once again in capstone. Do a little stretch, get a drink of water. Really pause the video, do it, come back in just a second. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going. Here's where I think we can have a lot of fun. So we've been talking a lot about social identities with parties. But I think that there is a huge opening for research when it comes to social identification with individuals and their fan bases, not just parties and their fan bases, but individuals and their fan bases. So hear me out. Maybe you guys remember back a few years ago when people started naming groups of fans around celebrities. So Beyonce, Queen Beyonce, right? She has a very intense fan base, and they have a name for themselves, Bayhive. Maybe you remember a phase that a lot of tweens went through, maybe it was you, with Justin Bieber. What did his fans call themselves? They called themselves Beliebers. When I see this, to me, this is a possible indicator of a social identity with a group. When you give your group a name, you're actually creating some sort of group boundary on that collection of people. So we have seen this with celebrities. So my question is, does this happen with individual politicians within parties? There's lots of politicians within each party. The time in which this might become the most interesting is primaries, right? The Republican Party in 2016 and the Democratic Party in 2020 both had lots and lots of candidates running for election. So my question is, have people been forming social identities around these candidates and their fan bases? For the entire history of this country, we have had parties and they have had factions within them. But this gets elevated at times of national elections, especially when we have social media. So there's a lot of candidates on the screen right now. These are all people who ran for the Democratic nomination in 2020. Some of these people, I think, maybe saw social identity happening with their fans. Well, let's go back to 2016. I'm going to show you a few flashes of this happening back in 2016. So you may recall that when Ted Cruz was running, they started using the phrase Cruz Crew. That's a name that they're putting on his fan base, right? We're part of the Cruz Crew. Suddenly there's a group name. You've probably heard people call themselves Trumpists. That's not that strange, but the Trump train, that was a phrase that started getting used when Trump was running for president, all aboard the Trump train. So this is sort of bringing people into what looks to be a little bit like a social identity. Where this really started getting quite intense, possibly, was with Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders obviously has a pretty devoted fan base. But after the election, when he did not get the nomination, there was a dating site that was developed just for Bernie Sanders fans. So this is sort of more than a group identity. This is now creating sort of a group environment and a group world after the election. So 2016 had a little bit of that going on. But let's look at 2020, because that's even more interesting. So 2020, possible social identity markers. So some of these names did start popping up for candidates. So first of all, Kamala Harris, who didn't last that long in the primary, but she has a pretty dedicated group of followers. And you can see this quite a bit on Twitter for all of these candidates, really. So her group of followers, they use a hashtag called the K-Hive. And that is a pretty common group name amongst people who are very sort of hardcore fans of hers. So you can see it right here. That's just it's actually a pretty popular Twitter handle. And then down below, there's a Vox article, the K-Hive, Kamala Harris's most devoted online supporters explained. So that's a group name that is being affixed to her supporters. Another group name that I've talked about a little bit in class is the Yang Gang. Andrew Yang was also a candidate for the Democratic nomination in 2020, and he actually used this phrase quite a bit when talking with his supporters online. So I think that they coined this term, Yang Gang, but he often used the phrase. I don't really see other politicians using the names of their fan bases this way, but Andrew Yang really did, often calling on the Yang Gang to donate, to support, to band together and do certain behaviors. You'll also notice that on two of these Twitter accounts, there are little hats next to these people's names. Those are indicators that people are in the Yang Gang. That's what that hat symbolizes. It's his math hat. So that emoji has been affixed to some of his supporters. So not only is there a name, now there's a symbol that's going right next to their Twitter handle online. And this is something that we've seen with other candidates as well. So this is fairly new, but Elizabeth Warren's supporters, particularly towards the end of her campaign, started putting a droplet of blood and a little tooth emoji next to their Twitter handles. Blood and teeth is an expression that has to do with a fight that she was in Congress, not a physical fight, but a legislative fight. So blood and teeth, that has been a social identity marker of Elizabeth Warren fans on Twitter. Let's keep going here. The red rose. So red rose Twitter, the red rose actually symbolizes democratic socialism, not a particular candidate. But it's been used more or less as a symbol of Bernie Sanders supporters. So we've got red roses, we've got math hats, we've got blood and teeth, and we have K-Hive, and we have Yang Gang. So are these just the modern day bumper stickers, or is this something greater? I'm not sure, but this is absolutely a conversation that we can be having on the discussion boards when we're done with this video lecture and when you guys are done with the readings. Speaking of readings, I want to give you guys a little teaser for what you're about to see, because I'm not going to talk about them in this video. I want you to do them on your own. So the first reading that you guys are going to do is about a concept called negative partisanship by Alan Abramowitz and Stephen Webster. This is a phrase that you are going to be hearing a lot of in the coming years. And there's many magazine style websites out there that are talking about negative partisanship. It is an inverse identity. We've talked about this a little bit before. When you have a negative identity, what that means is you don't identify as something. You identify as not this other thing. So you're going to read about negative partisanship, which is a very different take on partisan identity. And you're also going to read 2 chapters from a book called Independent Politics by Samara Klar and Yana Krupnikov. This is also a really important book that came out a few years ago. And here's the inspiration for their book. A few years back, Gallup started putting out polls showing that independent identification was getting to historic highs, which means people are identifying as independents more and partisans less. And we started seeing this in most of the Gallup polls and many of the Pew polls as well. That gray line that you're seeing there means that independent identification is up and partisan identification is down. So the authors of this book are very suspicious of this independent identification surge. Now I'm going to show you some tweets from some well-known people and some not so well-known people. This is Andrea Mitchell. She says, in theory, there's a good market for an independent candidate like Howard Schultz. If you look at the polling data, 42% of Americans now identify themselves as independents, more than Democrats, more than Republicans. By the time that you guys are done reading the 2 chapters from Independent Politics, you will know why this is potentially incorrect. Here's another tweet. Neera Tanden says, I don't think third-party voters should tell Democrats who should be on the Democratic stage. Republicans shouldn't either. Neera Tanden is someone who's affiliated with the Democratic Party. And then this random person from Red Rose Twitter writes back, we make up 47% of voters. So if you want to win, then you better start listening. Again, this is wrong. And when you guys finish reading Independent Politics, those first 2 chapters, you're going to know why this is wrong or why scholars think this is wrong. So I will leave you guys with that, some teasers for the reading, and also some good content for discussion questions for the discussion boards. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you in the next video.